And Chloe's going to ask the first question.
Okay. So can you tell us how you first became involved with Off Our Backs?
Yeah, well, it's something that I have since learned is a relatively common way of getting involved with Off Our Backs. I have, for the sake of my second book, I've been speaking with some women who were on the Furies, and certainly Kalita Reed told me a story that I recognized, which was she moved to DC. She wanted to get involved with feminism, and like, you can't look up feminism in the phone book, but I actually don't remember how I heard about offerbacks, but it turned out to be the perfect thing to be involved in when you move to a new city. And also, it was absolutely foundational to a lot of things in my life. But even for admitting that I don't remember exactly how I heard about it, I do remember going to the Offerbacks office. Again, there was a place, a real place that you could go to, a concrete address, which was in Adams Morgan on a very cool block. I believe it was on Columbia Road, just a couple of doors down from So's Your Mama, which was a great deli. It was one of the first delis I ever saw. Um, and Denise Cope was the office worker at that point, and she suggested that I could be an intern. And I did not know what an intern was. We didn't have interns at that point in Britain, or certainly I'd never heard of them. And I thought that just meant that I could just show up when I fancied it and, like it was a volunteer, which it kind of was. Everything was volunteer for the most part at Upper Backs. But I was not very good at, or it took me a while to understand that actually I needed to tell her when I was going to be there because she needed to have tasks for me. I recognize now, having had many jobs, where there are people who haven't really been in the workplace, that they don't understand like how work works. And I, at that point, was one of those people. But eventually, without ever really understanding what an intern was, I became an intern. And I guess a few months later, so that was in the very beginning of 1985. And then I guess I don't remember exactly how long it took for me to become a collective member rather than an intern and a friend. But I think it was probably by the end of that year, I was on the collective.
And what did it mean in 1985 to be a member of the collective? How did the organization structure its work?
So, as I recall, the thing that was different, so there were, and I do think I did watch Carol Ann's fantastic interview that you did, and she did definitely mention Friends, but I think it's important to kind of describe also what Friends were. So there was the collective. The collective were the people who made decisions about what was going to be in the magazine, and I do think that was kind of the separation point between the collective and other people who were around the magazine. And then there were Friends. Friends might have a lot of identities, might do different things, but for the most part they came to layout weekend and they helped with layout, and but they weren't necessarily involved, and they might write for the paper. Many of them did, but they just weren't involved in the decision making, and they kind of weren't obliged to come to layout in the way that collective members were. um, And so I remember very well the meeting where I was going to uh, I was kind of interviewing to join the collective, and Vicky Leonard, Victoria Leonard, who had been on the collective for a long time and who became a really good friend of mine. Um, she was the person who, in my kind of interview, I guess you could call it, said, I think it was something like, um, if you have any kind of agenda for joining Offerbacks, reveal it now. And I thought that was like so cool that I might have an agenda that I might need to reveal. I didn't, because I wasn't very imaginative, but I always, after that point, whenever people were joining the collective, I always kind of asked if I could be the person to ask that question. And I think every time I tried to make it even more ominous sounding, have you got an agenda? If so, reveal it now. Which obviously, if anybody did have an agenda, they definitely wouldn't reveal it in that way.
And what were the issues that were kind of roiling within the pages of Off Our Backs, in the collective, all of that during the 1980s? I mean, that was such a rich and conflictual time in the history of feminism.
It was. So I was around at Offerbacks between about 1985 and about 1990. I think I left towards the end of 1989. I left DC. Um, and obviously the big issue at that point, the big political issue was the sex wars, the kind of the fallout from the Barnard Conference. And I certainly was aware of that. And McKinnon, Dworkin, etc., the Meese Commission,
Mhm.
all of those things. But I have to say, and not because I was checked out, because for many years I was the office worker. In other words, I was the person who was there every day or most days. So it wasn't, I was definitely, present, body and soul, but that kind of was not what being part of Offerbacks was for me. It was more about the books that were coming in. It was about the kind of international stories. The thing that I was always very conscious of, and I'm afraid to admit that this might just be about me being quite a selfish or self-centered person, but it was just what an amazing opportunity it was to be at Offerbacks. I mean, one of the key things was that we got, from exchange subs, we got publications from all over America, from all over the world. And I felt that was getting this education not only in running a newspaper, which everybody on the collective was doing, but also in feminism, the books that came in, the magazines that came in, DC had an amazing feminist bookstore in Lamas, and it had a great gay bookstore in Lambda Rising, but they didn't get all those publications that we got. So I just remember, writing book reviews, interviewing people because, people were always coming through DC. And so it was more the kind of the being on the collective, the kind of the camaraderie of that relationship, which is a very unusual relationship. It is a kind of friendship. I think I would say I was friends with everyone who I was on the collective with. But it's not like when you're on the collective, you're not there to be friends, But it's also, I mean, and being on the Upper Best Collective was very hard work. It was a lot of hours. It was grind work. It wasn't like fun work, although it was great fun. But it wasn't a job, it was a vocation. It was something that we were doing because we were really invested in these ideas and wanted to be writing and sharing our thoughts. And so it was more that kind of fantastic experience of having a role, feminism and the women's liberation movement, all of those things are very kind of vague conceptual ideas. But when I was at Off Our Backs, I felt like it was really clear what my role was in this movement and what I was doing for feminism. And that felt really fantastic. Again, a very selfish, perhaps self-centered view of what feminism meant, but it was really great.
So how did things in the collective change from the 80s to the end of the 90s?
I was just there uh, between about 1985 and 1989. And it was quite a settled period. Yeah, 85 to the end of 89, I think was right. It was quite a settled period. There was some turnover. We got new collective members. Jenny Ruby joined, I remember, and someone who I feel very bad that I can't remember her name, because she was a fantastic member of the collective. She was, I believe, a working class woman, but she had gone to Harvard Law School, and that was a really important kind of perspective that she brought. But it was still, I watched Carol Ann's interview, and it was still in the friendly era. We weren't having big, uh, you know, ideological disputation within the collective. Um, we all got on, and so it wasn't a tremendously, as you say, it was a time when there were big arguments roiling feminism, but there weren't big arguments roiling the Off Our Backs collective. Some of they were quite things that I now think, like when I think back on the stories that I think were really important from that time, or not important, because certainly like the kind of NWSA coverage that Carol Ann especially would do, the coverage of what we now shorthand as the sex wars was hugely important. But like the stories that I remember were things like Adrienne Fu Berman, who was on the collective before I joined, and I think probably kind of went on leave because she went to medical school, and that was a lot of a big time commitment. So I don't recall her. I think she sometimes came to layout, but she wrote a series of really important articles about being a woman and a feminist in medical school. And this was again the mid 80s. It's 40 years ago, but like I remember being shocked that things were as sexist and patriarchal as they were in medical school at that point. Or Tricia Luton's wrote a piece called Lovers Who Don't Make Love, which again it was a I guess you would say a sociological piece, but that was like that also felt really important. And some of the book reviews, uh, and Chicken Lady. I often would fill in as Chicken Lady, which was for those who aren't didn't read Off Our Backs in that period. That was kind of the What's On section. Vicky Leonard usually did it, but sometimes I would, or maybe I took over at some point, and just kind of seeing what was going on around DC. But Off Our Backs was never really a DC publication; it was a national publication, so it would be what's going on around the country, um, and which was a tricky department to run because how do you do a what's on for a national publication. But that also was just, just a chance to see like that now when I look back sometimes, as I have been doing when doing research and looking at old issues of Off Our Backs, like, yeah, it's a great place to see what was happening. And yeah, I don't know that I had a sense of, playing that role, but now I realize we definitely did.
How do you see, after Off Our Backs, you went on and became a very influential journalist in the United States and in sort of mainstream journalism. I'm wondering if you would reflect a little bit on, is Off Our Backs one of the places where you learned about journalism? And just sort of how do you connect Off Our Backs with some of your later career work, or do you?
Yeah. Oh no, totally. Like everything I learned it off of X. Um, because that kind of hands-on, we're doing this, with our literally with our hands, that we typed things out on Selectric typewriters in columns, and then we put wax on the back and we stuck it on a sheet of layout paper, and then we proofed it, and then we had to type out, words that if there was a typo, we just would type that word and just stick it over the top. And you would always go home with like loads of words stuck to your sweater because you would lose words and have to type them like two or three times. I mean, that particular layout skill obviously has been replaced by technology, but all of the skills of deciding both what are we going to publish from submissions that are sent to us, asking for submissions on topics, deciding what we feel is important in the movement to cover. Um, Kind of, I am constantly surprised, again, shouldn't be, by how good like the news coverage was at Off Our Backs, both nationally and internationally, because it was done again like very seat of the pants. We didn't have any subscriptions. Well, again, we had the exchange subscriptions, but women on the collective would see stories and they would, cut them out of newspapers from across the country and follow up. And people were great writers. Some like Caroline were great at writing. Great narrative writer Fran Moira, as she was in the collective, fantastic science writer, just a beautiful writer. And, we had to come up with headlines. We had to run a magazine. We had to, as the office worker, things like depositing checks and adding people to the subscription list. And so those, and also just like learning to write. I remember Paula Krebs, who's now the executive director of the MLA. I know you know her, Julie. She had worked at the AP when she was in graduate school. And I remember showing her things that I was writing because often we would be writing things during layout weekend and her kind of, just very gently pointing out that I may have overwritten some things. And, basically, you as a writer, you learn by being edited. And so having really great editors in a very, deadline situation, it was amazing. And, you know, everything that we did other than the specifics of layout, which again have been replaced by technology, but you still have to do layout. You just do it in a different way. You still need the same things in a story. Um, and so I absolutely think that, that yes, it was the first step on the rest of my journalism career. I actually didn't go straight from Fairfax um, to journalism. I think I actually spent a couple of years in Spain, but then I went to Seal Press. And so I went to a feminist publishing company. And I believe that the connection was made because at Off Our Backs, I had interviewed Barbara Wilson, as she then was Barbara Sjöholm. And maybe I'd, reviewed some of their books or something. But, there was nothing careerist about Off Our Backs. You were not going to get a job from it. It wasn't that kind of, oh, if I work here, you maybe can be noticed by X. But that was because you couldn't take it into the straight world, and there weren't any jobs in feminism. So, you were doing it for the love of the thing itself. At the same time, I definitely did get jobs from it. I got the job at Seal probably because of my work at Off Our Backs. I never got a straight job because of it, because I don't think people had any understanding of what it was. It didn't sound particularly, uh, it didn't sounded weird, I guess. So if you hadn't seen it, you probably wouldn't kind of think, oh, well, she'll know about journalism. But yeah, it was a fantastic grounding and a fantastic place to learn.
Mhm. Are there particular contributions that you think of that you made to Off Our Backs during the 4 or 5 years you were there that feel important?
Um, probably this is something that you shouldn't say about yourself, but I think in my time I mean, I did write, probably most months, and those pieces were fine. But I actually think that probably my biggest contribution was in kind of trying to make the like being part of the collective fun. So for example, having layout, having food at layout, having sustenance, because again, it was really hard work. You had to get there early Saturday morning, and you didn't leave until the end of Sunday when you had, the magazine full. Every page needed to be full. You couldn't turn in a empty page. And that had to be well organized, but it had to be kind of, if people were, if it was hard to fill a page, you had to kind of not chivvy them along because that sounds negative, but you had to maintain a good vibe, basically. And that I do think that I hope that I was able to do that and make being at collective meetings, which again, like every Thursday night, this was the height of must see TV too. And every Thursday night you had to be in the collective meeting in the office. So, like making that be as fun and pleasant as possible. I actually think that was probably my biggest contribution.
And is there anything you wish you would have done differently during your time working on Off Our Backs?
Um, I mean, obviously, it was a mostly white collective. Many of the friends were women of color, and I don't say this as an excuse or a justification, but I know for myself, it was the consciousness of how much time this was and how it was its own reward, like you didn't even get like, there wasn't even prestige, there wasn't even, you would walk into the bar and everyone would applaud you. Like nobody knew who the hell you were. Like it didn't have any reward except the work itself. And I know I never actually tried to get anyone to join the collective because it just felt like, would you like to do hours and hours of uncompensated work, um, you know, for a long period? So while I do feel that that was a failure of me as a collective member and of the collective, I also kind of know what was going on in my mind at least. And I don't know. I don't know that I feel too bad about the my personal, like what was going on inside my head at that time. Um, Otherwise, like we were shockingly international. Like that feels amazing. And I don't mean actually in the composition of the collective. I mean in what we published. Another uh, Alice Henry was on the collective when I was there. Again, somebody who I then later lived with in London. Like again, these were the kind of connections that you could make, or could make makes again sound like an exploitation kind of situation, but like you would work closely together. You were friends. Um, she at the time, her partner was British, and she had worked on the Spare Rib Collective, and like that kind of international feminist publication interaction, that was amazing. It was amazing for me who had grown up reading it and didn't know anybody. I know I'd never lived in London at that point. I didn't know anyone who was on the Offerbacks Collective, I mean, who was on the Spare Rib Collective. So that felt really amazing too. Another thing, actually, another something I wish had been different on the collective. Like I think I was the only working class woman on the collective. As I said, toward the end, there was a Harvard Law School graduate. I'm ashamed that that is how I identify her. I wish I could remember her name. I think she was working class, but like it was a pretty middle class to upper middle class group of women. Some of the friends were working class, but so again, like that was a limitation, but also again, who so am I going to ask more marginalized women to do some free work? That always felt a bit wrong somehow.
I know you weren't involved when Off Our Backs eventually changed format and then
Hmm.
closed, but I
Hmm.
also know you've thought a lot about these formations from the 70s, 80s, and 90s
Yeah,
through your book, and
right.
what they meant, um, and how the world has changed, how there been
Yeah.
changes. So I wonder what reflections you have on the end of Off Our Backs, the loss of it, and what that means.
Yeah. I'm sort of torn because, as I said in my book, I don't think the purpose of these institutions was ever to exist forever. Like that, longevity wasn't, if you would ask, we didn't ever, at least in my time there, ever kind of do goal setting exercises or any of those kinds of things. But if we had, I'm fairly sure that, longevity wouldn't have been a value that we were optimizing for. And while certainly, again, as a researcher, Offerbacks has been valuable to me throughout its run, from those early 70s toward, right into the last issues. They're great resources. But I mean, I just suspect that, everything has its time, everything has its moment. And I, I kind of think that, the time for a, a publication that relies on newsstand sales. And I know that toward the end, there was a that donation, there were some grants, but I do think it kind of needed to be self-supporting, and that just became extraordinarily difficult as a publication. But I think I also agree with Caroline that it needed to be a publication, that it needed to have that we do this every month. We do this 11 times a year, and we just gotta keep going because that was a necessary part uh, of the DNA of Off Our Backs. Um, and so I don't think it could have it a different the same group of women or a new group of women could have created something with a very similar name online, but I just think like that particular publication, that was how far it was supposed to go, I think.
And what would you like people to understand as the legacy of Off Our Backs?
I mean, I do think I mean the publication stands for itself. I do think like it is so worth looking at those issues, like just pretty much any one of them, Um, they are great, slices, like a time machine, you to go back to July 1978 or, whatever. You can just drop in, and it is just so much fun and also a great learning experience um, to just read what was in those pages. I think I was only there for 5 years, max, maybe more like four. And so I'm not taking this as credit to myself, but like the women on the collective really took seriously um, their intention of covering the movement, of going to conferences and writing up, lots and lots of breakout sessions and plenary sessions and just doing the work like that. The work stands for itself, I think. But I also do think that it something that is maybe not so visible on the page of partly it's a business story. I mean, one of the things that uh, I'm not sure, I don't know if this is just my idea or if it is just accepted, but I think that one of the things that really it didn't cause, but it was, I think, had a large role in the kind of the shrinking of the subscription base above her backs was Ms. Magazine deciding not to take ads anymore. Now that was seen as a positive thing for Ms. But that meant that there were no more exchange ads. I mean, that was, many of the ads that were in Off Our Backs were in exchange for example, we had an exchange ad with Alison Bechdel for running Dykes to Watch Out For. And we had an exchange ad with Ms. Or maybe we paid for it. We might have paid for it. It would have been worth paying for it. I actually don't remember. But finding kind of providing women with a way of encountering the magazine for the first time. Because again, like women come to consciousness as feminists, maybe as lesbian feminists at all different times. They're not necessarily in a feminist bookstore. Feminist bookstores, of course, became less common. It just became more difficult to discover. And as somebody who worked in podcasts for many years, where discovery is the biggest challenge. Discovery was also a challenge for Off Our Backs. And yeah, as the whole ecosystem declined, as there were fewer bookstores, that was another kind of an outlet that not ceased to exist, but became far less common. It became much less of a common experience for women to have an opportunity to, go through the shelves in feminist bookstores. So I just think it was a little bit of the times, and it's hard, and it was so much work to put out the magazine, and people joined the collective to put out a magazine, you know, not to do feminist business. And so I think there wasn't a vision to counter, everything that was causing the end of feminist institutions or the decline. Um, I think, feminist institutions are rebounding. I think that, they're having another moment right now. And of course, there's a lot of feminism online, but I don't see a publication like Off Our Backs, covering conferences. That but then again, I might not know. It's. I'm also very conscious that in the early days of the women's liberation movement, notes from the first year, notes from the second year, there was this idea that you could read everything that was being published. You know, there's no hope of that anymore. So, maybe that's just an impossible dream now.
Mhm. Mhm. Is there anything we haven't asked you about that you want to share about Off Our Backs?
No, I guess this is not unique to Off Our Backs, but just this role of being on a collective with someone. What I don't even know even what you call it, a collective mate, a collective colleague, somebody. Because I remember, I went to Athens, Georgia a couple of years ago, and with somebody who I was spending time with, somebody I was on the collective with, who was a teacher at the University of Georgia, yes, yeah, the University of Georgia for many years, and people kept saying, "Oh, how do you guys know each other?" And like, well, we were on a collective together. It's a very special and unique relationship, and I think it is something that we particularly experience in political environments. Maybe, old school political people maybe were in cells. I don't know, cellmate, that's also something quite different. So, that's just such a special, why you have a commitment to something so much that put in all this time and, sacrifice for something that uh, you know, is its own reward. That's it's very interesting to me. But it was an incredible learning experience in so many ways,
Yeah,
and lots of fun as well.
excellent. Thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording.
All right.